They said weddings are supposed to be the most magical day of your life, the kind of day that lingers in your memory like a favorite photograph. The dress, the vows, the laughter, the tears. But when I stood there at the altar, looking out, at the rows of faces, all I saw were empty chairs where my parents should have been. It wasn't a scheduling conflict. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They had told me, in their own sharp words, that my wedding was nothing but a trivial event for someone at the bottom. They said their presence was better reserved for occasions that mattered. Imagine hearing that from the very people who raised you, who were supposed to stand proudly by your side no matter what. Instead, I was left to paste on a smile, hiding the sting in my chest as I tried to focus on the man who actually wanted to build a life with me. But let me tell you something. Those empty chairs didn't just mark absence. They marked a line in the sand. The moment I realized I was no longer willing to bend under the weight of their judgment. I didn't cry that day. I didn't beg them to reconsider. I tucked the pain away, let it sit quietly, because I knew there would come a time when I would show them exactly how wrong they were about me. They thought they had humiliated me, diminished me. But what they didn't see coming was how that single act would ignite a fire in me that changed everything. And when the tables finally turned, they would learn that calling me someone at the bottom was the last mistake they'd ever make. I grew up in a household where appearances were everything, where reputation mattered more than honesty, where money was flaunted like a crown, and success was the only language spoken at the dinner table. My parents were not just strict, they were obsessed with hierarchy, with who was on top and who was beneath. My brother, their golden child, could do no wrong. Every mistake of his was an experiment, every failure a stepping stone. Me? I was the cautionary tale, the quiet one, the one they labeled soft, the one they warned not to dream too big because dreamers fall hardest. From the time I was a teenager, my achievements were brushed aside like dust. Straight A's in school? That's expected. A scholarship I fought tooth and nail for? It's not an Ivy League, so don't get carried away. And when I met Daniel, the man who became my husband, they didn't just roll their eyes. They sneered. He wasn't from their circle, not a polished banker or lawyer, not the son of their country club friends. He was a builder, literally. He worked in construction, hands calloused, boots always dusty. But his laugh was warm, his loyalty unwavering, and he treated me with more respect than my parents ever had. To me, that was worth more than any pedigree. To them, it was proof I had settled, proof I was bottom tier. That's the phrase they used, over and over, until it dug into my skin like glass. When we got engaged, I knew it was coming, the dismissive comments, the veiled insults, but I didn't think they'd go as far as boycotting the wedding. Weeks before, my mother sat across from me, pearl necklace gleaming, and said, "Do you really expect us to parade ourselves in front of everyone for this trivial event? Darling, we have reputations to maintain." My father didn't even look up from his newspaper, just muttered, "It's beneath us." And that was it. They weren't coming. No teary mother helping me into my dress. No proud father walking me down the aisle. Just absence, cold and deliberate. But here's the thing. As much as it hurt, a part of me knew it was the final proof I needed. Proof that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried, I would never be enough for them unless I played by their rules. And I was done playing. What they didn't realize was that in skipping my wedding, they weren't embarrassing me, they were freeing me. Because I had already begun building something of my own, something they had no clue about, something that would one day force them to see me in a light they could never dim again. And when that day came, they would regret every empty chair, every insult, every time they called me trivial. The weeks after my wedding were a blur of emotions. There were moments of joy, like when Daniel and I settled into our little home, fixing things together late into the night, laughing at how mismatched our furniture was, but proud because it was ours. But behind the laughter, there was still a heaviness. Every time I looked at the wedding photos, I couldn't escape the glaring gap where my parents should have stood. Friends asked where they were, whispering their questions gently as if I'd break in front of them. I smiled. I lied. I said they were traveling, that something urgent had come up. But inside, the truth sat like a stone. They hadn't come because they thought my happiness wasn't worth their time. And that burned. Still, life moved on. Daniel encouraged me to throw myself into what I loved most, growing things. Ever since I was a girl, the garden was my sanctuary. When other kids begged for toys, I asked for seeds. By the time I was in my 20s, I had designed small urban gardens for neighbors, transforming barren patches into bursts of green. Daniel believed in me more than anyone ever had. He said, "Why not make it a business? You've got the gift, and people need it." That's when I started my greenhouse project. It was small at first, just a modest glass structure at the edge of our property. But it was mine. Every flower bed, every sprout, every bloom was proof that I could create beauty from nothing. Clients started noticing. Orders trickled in. Then, flooded. Soon, I wasn't just tending to plants. I was supplying boutique florists, upscale cafes, even wedding planners. Word spread faster than I imagined, and suddenly I had contracts that my parents would have killed to brag about at their country club luncheons. I didn't tell them, of course. Part of me wanted to. I wanted to march into their polished dining room, contracts in hand, and say, "See, I built this, without you." But I held back. I wanted the reveal to be bigger, undeniable, something they couldn't laugh off as a fluke. Meanwhile, they carried on as if I didn't exist. My brother called once, smug as ever, to gloat about some promotion. When I mentioned the greenhouse, he chuckled and said, "That's cute, a hobby." My mother sent a holiday card with a photo of them in Italy, no personal note, just their names scribbled like an obligation. And my father, silence. But I kept working. I poured every ounce of myself into that greenhouse and it grew. Not just in size, but in reputation. I was invited to speak at a sustainability conference, rubbing shoulders with people whose names carried weight. I shook hands, exchanged business cards, landed deals I never thought possible. And with each step forward, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer the bottom they called me. I was climbing, brick by brick, seed by seed. They just didn't know it yet. And when they finally did, when the truth landed in their laps like a thunderclap, it wouldn't just sting. It would shatter the perfect little image they had built of themselves at the top. It was about 2 years into my marriage when the turning point came, the moment their carefully constructed world and my quietly built one began to collide. By then, my greenhouse wasn't just a side business anymore, it was thriving. I had expanded to 3 additional structures, hired staff, and launched an online store that shipped nationwide. What started as a dream in soil and glass was now pulling in contracts that made my accountant shake his head in disbelief. I was negotiating with luxury hotels for floral installations, and I had just signed a long-term deal with a high-end grocery chain to supply fresh herbs and organic greens. But here's the twist: the grocery chain? It was partly owned by a holding company, and that holding company was where my father and brother both had investments. They had no idea the hobby they mocked was now indirectly tied to their portfolio. It wasn't until a glossy business magazine did a feature on young entrepreneurs reviving sustainable agriculture that my name hit their radar. My face was on the cover, standing in front of rows of blooming orchids, the headline splashed across in bold. Friends sent me congratulations. Daniel beamed with pride. Even strangers messaged me saying my story inspired them. But the call I got that evening was the one that changed everything. My mother's voice, sharp and dripping with the kind of fake sweetness she reserved for people she needed something from, rang through the phone. "Darling, we saw the article. Quite unexpected. Why didn't you tell us?" I almost laughed. Why didn't I tell them? Maybe because when I first started, they called it trivial. Maybe because they skipped the most important day of my life, declaring me unworthy. But I bit my tongue. I simply said, "You never asked." There was silence. Then my father's gruff voice cut in. "We should meet. This is significant. Your work reflects well on the family." That's when it hit me. Not on me. On the family. Suddenly, my success wasn't mine to them. It was a shiny ornament they could hang on their wall, proof that their bloodline still gleamed with prestige. They wanted to use me, my work, my name, to boost their image. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I realized the power had shifted. For the first time, they needed me. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that I would never let them own what I built. But I also knew better than to slam the door immediately. No, I wanted them to walk in, smug and entitled, convinced they could bend me back into their narrative. Because only then would they truly feel the weight of what I had become. They insisted on a family dinner, the first in years, at their favorite restaurant. The kind of place with white tablecloths, waiters in crisp uniforms, and chandeliers that seemed to drip with gold. I walked in with Daniel by my side, my head held higher than it had ever been, and I could feel their eyes on me the moment I entered. My mother rose, air kissing my cheek as if we hadn't been estranged, her perfume suffocating and cloying. My father offered a stiff handshake, his eyes scanning me not with warmth but with calculation, like I was an asset on a balance sheet. My brother smirked, swirling his wine glass, already rehearsing some backhanded comment. We sat, menus placed, before us, but the real meal was the conversation they intended to devour. My mother started, her tone syrupy. "We've been thinking, darling, your little greenhouse, well, it's really grown into something. With the right guidance, it could become part of the family's portfolio. Imagine how much further it could go if it were tied to our name." My father nodded in agreement, adding, "You've done well, but you're still small compared to what we could make it. We'd introduce you to the right investors. Ensure you're taken seriously. In exchange, of course, you'd fold it under the family umbrella. Call it legacy." Legacy. That word tasted bitter. Because to them, legacy was just control-dressed, up in silk. They weren't proud of me. They were circling like vultures, realizing my success could be repackaged as theirs. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, grounding me as anger simmered in my chest. My brother finally spoke, leaning back with his smug grin. "Honestly, it's a smart move for you. Without us, you'll hit a ceiling. With us, you'll be unstoppable. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can do this alone." That was the moment I almost laughed out loud. Alone? I had been alone since the day they skipped my wedding. Alone when they mocked my choices, when they dismissed my work, when they cut me out of their world. And yet here I was, thriving, proving them wrong with every contract, every accolade. I looked around that table, at their greedy, expectant faces, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply smiled and said, "I'll think about it." Because letting them believe they had a chance was the sweetest setup for the blow I was already preparing. A blow that would strip away the power they clung to and leave them grasping at shadows. Over the next few weeks, they hovered closer than they ever had in my adult life. My mother called regularly, her voice painted with false enthusiasm, always fishing for details about my business. "How many orders are you getting now, darling? Have you considered expanding into Europe? We could connect you with some marvelous people we know in Milan." My father sent me articles about mergers and acquisitions, thinly veiled attempts to push me toward folding into their sphere. Even my brother, who once laughed at me, started sending messages dripping with condescension. If you sign on with us, I'll make sure you're not just another vendor in the chain. You'll have a real seat at the table. They thought they were pulling me into their world, but what they didn't know was that I had already built my own table, and theirs was about to crumble. See, what my parents hadn't realized was that their holding company was already entangled with my contracts. The grocery chain deal they were so proud to tout at their board meetings, I was one of its most profitable suppliers. My signature was on agreements they depended on to keep their numbers high. And because they hadn't cared to learn about me until now, they had overlooked just how deeply my work had become woven into the very fabric of their investments. I started quietly, tightening my grip. I renegotiated terms with the chain, securing exclusivity clauses that cut out middlemen and gave me leverage. I invested in scaling operations faster, hiring more staff, upgrading facilities, doubling production. And all the while, I smiled through my parents' phone calls, letting them believe I was still considering their offer. What I was really doing was preparing for the moment when the truth would hit them, when they would realize that not only did I not need them, but their empire now needed me. That truth came crashing down one rainy afternoon when I received a panicked call not from my family, but from one of their business associates. He had recognized my company name in the supply contracts, pieced together the puzzle, and knew exactly what it meant. "You realize," he said, his voice low and urgent, "that your parents' firm relies on you now? They've been bragging about their grocery chain's growth, but without your supply line, those numbers vanish. They don't own you. You own them." I hung up the phone, heart pounding, a strange mix of vindication and fury swirling in my chest. For years they had told me I was nothing, that I was trivial, that I was at the bottom. And now, without me, their so-called legacy would begin to crack. They thought they had been playing me, but the game was mine all along. The next family dinner was different. This time they weren't smug, they were restless. My father's jaw was tight, his fingers drumming on the table as if he was trying to hold back his temper. My mother's smile was thinner, brittle around the edges, her pearls still gleaming but her confidence clearly shaken. My brother kept glancing at his phone, as though waiting for news he didn't want to hear out loud. I knew why. By then, word had spread. Through their circle, investors were whispering, connecting the dots between my greenhouse empire and their precious holdings. People were asking questions. Why had they ignored me? Why hadn't they showcased me sooner? Were they losing their grip? And for a family, built entirely on reputation, perception was poison. My father finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. "We need to discuss this properly. It seems circumstances have changed. You've done well, but it's reckless to go it alone when so much is at stake. Fold it in with us, before outsiders think the family is divided." My mother chimed in quickly, as if rehearsed. "Yes, darling, unity is everything. Imagine the headlines if we announced a merger. You'd be secure, and so would we." I leaned back, letting their desperation wash over me. For the first time, they weren't offering me something. They were begging. They needed me to protect their image, their investments, their pride. But I remembered every word they'd spat at me every time they made me feel small. I remembered the empty chairs at my wedding, the way they dismissed Daniel, the years of silence and judgment. And I knew I would never hand over what I had built. Still, I didn't say no. Not yet. I wanted the knife to twist a little deeper, so I smiled sweetly and said, "Maybe. But if we do this, it's on my terms. I don't become part of your legacy. You become part of mine." My father's eyes narrowed, my mother's face froze, and my brother actually scoffed. Your legacy. Don't kid yourself. You wouldn't be here without us. That was when Daniel spoke up, calm but firm. She's here in spite of you. Don't forget that. His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, my parents had no immediate retort. They were losing their grip, and they knew it. What they didn't know yet was that I had already drawn up contracts, ones that would cement my independence permanently. They thought they were still negotiating. But in reality, the deal was already done, and they weren't part of it. The breaking point came on a gray Monday morning when my parents summoned me to their house as if I were still a child under their command. Their mansion looked the same as always. Perfectly manicured lawn, imported marble steps, the air of superiority clinging to every brick. But the energy inside was different. They weren't smug this time. They were frantic. My mother ushered me into the sitting room, clutching a cup of tea so tightly her knuckles were white. My father stood by the window, not looking at me, staring out as if the glass could shield him from reality. My brother was pacing, his phone buzzing nonstop on the coffee table. "The board is asking questions," my father said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Numbers are slipping, and everyone is starting to realize why. They've linked the supply contracts back to you. They know you hold the leverage." My mother's eyes darted toward me, sharp and desperate. "We can fix this, darling. All you have to do is sign the papers, merge your company with ours. Once it's under the family's name, no one will dare question us." My brother jumped in, his tone snapping. "Stop playing games. This isn't about you anymore. It's about all of us. Do you want to see everything our family built go up in smoke?" I sat there, calm, watching their world unravel, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in their presence. I felt powerful, because the truth was simple. Without me, their empire would crack. With me, it would survive. But only if I allowed it. And I wasn't going to. I let the silence stretch until my mother shifted uncomfortably, until my brother cursed under his breath. Then I spoke, steady and measured. "You called my wedding trivial. You called me bottom tier. You left me standing at the altar without my family. Now you want to call what I've built yours? No, you don't get to rewrite history because it's convenient. You don't get to profit off the daughter you humiliated." My father finally turned, his face pale, his pride stripped bare. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I stood, smoothing my dress, Daniel's words from that dinner echoing in my head. I was here in spite of them. "No," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "The only thing I regret is thinking you'd ever be proud of me. But I don't need your pride anymore, and you need me more than I'll ever need you." I walked out that day, their silence heavy behind me. And it was the first time I realized the roles had reversed completely. They weren't my judges anymore. They were the ones waiting for my verdict. From that day forward, I cut off their calls. Emails went unanswered. Dinner invitations tossed in the trash. For once in my life, I wasn't scrambling for their approval. They were scrambling for mine. And with every week that passed, their desperation grew. I started hearing things through mutual acquaintances, whispers that my father's board was growing restless, that investors were threatening to pull out unless they secured a guarantee from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who once dismissed me as trivial were now sitting in boardrooms, biting their nails over my next move. Meanwhile, my company soared. I expanded distribution to multiple states, invested in renewable energy systems that cut costs in half, and partnered with eco-conscious brands that boosted our visibility tenfold. Articles praised me as a pioneer in sustainable agriculture, a visionary who was changing the way people thought about food and florals. Every headline was another nail in the coffin of my parents' narrative that I was the family disappointment. Daniel watched me with quiet pride, always reminding me not to lose sight of why I started in the first place. You didn't build this for them, he'd say. You built this for you. He was right. And yet, part of me wanted them to see it all. To choke on the truth of how wrong they had been. That chance came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I received a letter. Not from my parents, but from their lawyers. A formal request for a partnership agreement, dressed up in legal jargon, but at its core nothing more than a plea for me to save their crumbling reputation. I sat with Daniel at the kitchen table, the letter between us, and for a moment I felt the old sting of their control. But then I remembered the empty chairs at my wedding, the years of silence, the way my father's voice had dripped with disdain when he called me beneath us. I picked up a pen, wrote 2 simple words across the bottom of the letter, "Not interested," and mailed it back. Days later, the fallout began. Their company stock dipped after rumors spread of instability. My father was forced to step down from a leadership role, my brother's promotion stalled, and my mother's social circle, once so tight, began to whisper behind her back. They had tried to erase me, but now it was their names being dragged through mud, their reputations unraveling thread by thread. And through it all, I didn't gloat. I didn't send a single message to rub it in. I simply kept building, kept growing, proving with every step that I was never at the bottom. I had been climbing all along. The final blow came when the grocery chain, the very crown jewel my parents bragged about owning a stake in, announced a press conference. They were unveiling a new sustainability initiative, and I was at the center of it. Cameras flashed as I walked on stage, my company's logo displayed behind me, executives praising my work as the backbone of their growth. I spoke about resilience, about building something from the ground up, about believing in yourself when no one else does. I didn't name my parents, but every word was a dagger they couldn't ignore. The next morning, my face was splashed across financial news sites, headlines declaring me the future of green enterprise. And just like that, everyone in their world knew their daughter, the one they'd dismissed and humiliated, wasn't just successful. She was indispensable. That same evening, my mother showed up at my house unannounced. Her perfect hair was slightly out of place, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept. She stood on my porch holding a gift bag, as if a token offering could erase years of cruelty. "Darling," she whispered when I opened the door, her voice trembling, "we've made mistakes. We want to make things right." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see power or superiority. I saw fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of losing the image she had polished her whole life. And I realized something. I didn't hate her. I didn't even want revenge anymore. What I wanted was freedom. "You made your choice," I said, my voice steady. "You decided I wasn't worth showing up for, and now you don't get to show up when it benefits you. That's not how family works." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't move. I didn't invite her in. I closed the door softly, not with anger, but with finality. Inside, Daniel wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Because I finally understood that their approval had never been the prize. My life, my love, my work, that was the prize. And they could never take that from me. Not long after, the silence between us became permanent. My parents, once the loudest voices in my life, faded into background whispers of scandal and regret. Their company limped along, struggling to maintain its footing without the leverage they'd hoped to wrestle from me. At the country club they once ruled, I heard through friends, their names were no longer spoken with admiration, but with pity. How could they let their daughter slip through their fingers? People asked. My brother, furious at the fallout, sent me a string of bitter messages blaming me for tearing the family apart. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The truth was simple. I hadn't torn anything apart. I just refused to carry the weight of their arrogance anymore. Meanwhile, my own world flourished. The greenhouse empire grew beyond anything I could have imagined when I first planted those seeds. We opened a flagship showroom in the city, a glass structure filled with cascading flowers and lush greenery that became a landmark in its own right. Couples booked weddings there, children pressed their noses to the glass to watch. Butterflies danced through the air, and people whispered about the woman who had built it all from nothing. And through it all, Daniel was by my side, his quiet strength reminding me of the day I chose him over their approval, the day that really set me free. Sometimes, late at night, I would think back to my wedding, the empty chairs, the sting of their absence, and I realized it no longer hurt. Those empty seats had given me clarity. They had taught me that family isn't blood, it's love, loyalty, and presence. It's the people who show up when it matters. My parents chose not to, and so I built a life without them, a better life, a stronger one. And though they may never admit it, I know the truth cuts deeper than anything I could ever say out loud. The daughter they once dismissed as trivial had risen higher than they could ever reach. Years passed, and with time, the distance between us became not just emotional, but absolute. I stopped checking for their names in the news, stopped waiting for another letter or call, stopped imagining some apology that would never come. But occasionally, life has a way of circling back. One evening, I was invited to a gala hosted by the very grocery chain that had helped elevate my business into the spotlight. It was a black tie event, chandeliers glittering, glasses clinking, conversations humming with the cadence of power and influence. As Daniel adjusted my bracelet before we walked in, I caught sight of them across the room. My parents, standing stiff and uncomfortable, a shadow of the regal figures they used to be. Their smiles were strained, their posture no longer commanding, but defensive, as though they knew they no longer belonged in that world. When I stepped onto the stage later that night to accept an award for innovation in sustainable business, I didn't look directly at them. I didn't need to. I knew they were watching, knew that every word of praise that rolled from the presenter's mouth was another reminder of what they had cast aside. The applause washed over me like a tide, not because I craved it, but because it symbolized everything I had built on my own. Afterward, people crowded around me, eager to shake my hand, to congratulate me, to tell me how inspired they were by my journey. And there in the corner, my parents stood alone, ignored, no longer the center of attention. For the first time in their lives, they weren't at the top. They were forgotten. And I realized then that my revenge had never needed to be loud or cruel. It was in the quiet dignity of knowing I had succeeded without them, that their absence had not destroyed me but defined me. The very emptiness they left had become the soil where I grew stronger, more resilient, unshakable. And while they faded into the background, I kept walking forward, hand in hand with the man who had always believed in me, toward a future they could neither control nor diminish. The true ending began quietly, not with some dramatic confrontation, but with an envelope that arrived in my mailbox. Heavy paper, my father's handwriting on the front. For a moment, my hands shook as I opened it, but inside was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years they had stolen from me. It was a will, a draft of their estate planning, lines and signatures, with my name penciled in like an afterthought, not as a daughter, but as a tool. They wanted me to inherit part of their crumbling business to continue the family legacy. Legacy, that word again. Even in writing, it dripped with arrogance, as if they could still rewrite history, still bind me to them through contracts and property. I laughed, a bitter, quiet laugh, and slid the papers back into the envelope. I didn't need their wealth, their name, or their approval. I had built something stronger than money, freedom. Days later, I mailed the envelope back, unopened and unsigned, with a single note tucked inside. Family isn't built on paper. It's built on presence. You chose to be absent. And then I let it go. Completely. No more wondering if they would change. No more holding space for them in my heart. The closure wasn't in their recognition. It was in my refusal to be chained to them any longer. My greenhouse empire continued to bloom, but more than that, my life did. Daniel and I traveled, laughing under foreign skies. We opened scholarships for young women in agriculture, giving opportunities to girls who, like me, had once been told they weren't enough. I watched their eyes light up when they realized they could grow something of their own, and it felt like rewriting my own past, in the most beautiful way. And still, every once in a while, I'd hear whispers of my parents, how their circle shrank, how their influence waned, how the people they once impressed turned away. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My existence was the proof. My happiness the verdict. My independence the legacy they could never claim. They had called my wedding trivial. They had called me at the bottom. Yet in the end, it was me who stood tall, and them who faded into irrelevance. That was my revenge. Not loud, not cruel, but absolute. The years rolled on, and the space between us became a canyon too wide to cross. My parents grew older, and though I rarely saw them, I heard through secondhand whispers how their health was failing, how the house that once dazzled with dinner parties now sat quiet, curtains drawn, visitors rare. The empire they had built, the one they once guarded like a fortress, had dwindled into fragments. Their names no longer carried weight in business circles. They were remembered more for arrogance than achievement. One afternoon, I was asked to give a keynote at a major sustainability summit. Thousands of people in attendance, cameras broadcasting live. As I walked across the stage, the applause was thunderous, not just for what I had built, but for what I represented: resilience, independence, the power to rise above dismissal. And as I stood there speaking about growth and legacy, I realized something profound. My life was no longer about them at all. They had been the obstacle, the shadow, the test, but the story was mine. My parents had chosen absence on the most important day of my life, and in that absence, I had learned how to show up for myself. That was the root of everything. After the summit, as Daniel and I drove home, he asked softly, "Do you ever wish they had been different?" I thought about it, staring at the horizon painted gold by the setting sun. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but if they had been, I might never have found the strength to be who I am now. Their rejection forced me to write my own story." He reached for my hand, and I knew that was the truth. My revenge wasn't about their downfall anymore. It was about my survival, my triumph, my peace. And that was something they could never touch. Not long after the summit, I received word that my father had been hospitalized. Heart problems, the kind that strip a man of the authority he once wore. Like armor, my mother reached out through a carefully typed email, polite but detached, asking if I would come for the sake of family. I stared at the message for a long time, my chest tight with memories. The girl I used to be would have dropped everything, desperate to be seen, desperate for even a flicker of acknowledgement. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I closed the laptop without replying. Weeks passed before I finally agreed to visit, not out of duty, but out of curiosity. The hospital room was dim, the steady beep of machines filling the silence. My father looked smaller, diminished, his once commanding frame swallowed by the bed. My mother sat beside him, her hair grayer now, her posture still perfect, but her eyes tired. When she saw me, her face crumpled in a way I had never seen before. "We made mistakes," she whispered, voice breaking. "We thought we were protecting the family. We thought we were teaching you to be strong." My father's eyes opened briefly, watery and sunken. He didn't speak much, just murmured, "We were wrong." It should have felt like victory, hearing the words I had once begged for. But instead, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just a hollow recognition that it was too late. Words don't mend years of absence. Apologies don't fill empty chairs. I nodded politely, but my heart remained untouched. They wanted forgiveness as a balm for their own guilt, not as a true act of love. After that day, I visited only once more. I sat quietly in the corner, watching the machines hum, watching the two people who had once seemed invincible now fade into fragility. And in that quiet, I realized my revenge had already been written. Not through their suffering, but through the life I had carved in their absence. Every flower blooming in my greenhouse, every contract signed, every young woman I mentored was proof of what they could never destroy. When I left that room for the last time, I didn't look back. Outside, the world was bright, the air crisp with the scent of spring, life continuing as it always had. I walked toward Daniel waiting by the car, my chest light, my heart steady. Whatever happened to them now was no longer part of my story. I had given them enough years. The rest belonged to me. Months later, I learned through a brief phone call from a distant relative that my father had passed quietly in his sleep. My mother, too, withdrew further into isolation. The grand house that once hosted glittering soirees now reduced to silence and dust. There was no funeral invitation, no formal gathering of mourners. Just a quiet end to lives once lived so loudly. When I heard the news, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply sat in my greenhouse, the air humid and fragrant with roses and basil, and let the silence wrap around me. In that moment, I realized that the story had finally closed itself without me needing to lift a finger. They had chosen to skip my wedding, declaring me trivial, at the bottom, unworthy of their presence. But in the end, it was their absence that defined them, not me. Their refusal to stand by me on the most important day of my life had been the seed of my freedom. And from that seed, I had grown something vast and unshakable. My empire flourished more than ever, but it wasn't just about contracts and accolades anymore. It was about legacy. A real one, not the kind my parents had obsessed over. I opened community gardens in low-income neighborhoods, teaching children how to nurture plants, how to find pride in creating life. I built scholarships for young women who dreamed of agriculture, giving them the tools to build futures no one could take away. Each smile, each bloom, each hand planting a seed was proof that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up, who stands beside you, who believes in you when no one else does. Daniel and I built a life filled with love and laughter, with travel and adventures, with quiet mornings in the greenhouse and long nights under the stars. We became each other's anchor, each other's chosen family, proving that love built on respect is stronger than any empire built on fear. And sometimes when I walked through the flagship showroom, glass walls glinting, orchids climbing toward the ceiling, customers marveling at the beauty, I would remember those empty chairs at my wedding. They no longer hurt. Instead, they reminded me of where I started, of the line I drew, of the power I claimed. My parents had once believed I would always be beneath them. But in the end, it was me who stood tallest, not because I crushed them, but because I rose without them. That was my revenge, to live fully, to love deeply, to thrive brilliantly. Their absence became my strength, their judgment my fuel, their rejection my rebirth. And so I closed the chapter on them with no bitterness, no longing, only peace. They skipped my wedding. They called me trivial. And in doing so, they lost the right to witness the extraordinary life I built. The final victory was never theirs to claim. It was mine all along,